I want you to think about the last time that you truly rested. I'm not referring to the last time that you were in bed scrolling or when you collapsed from exhaustion at the end of a 14-hour day. I don't mean when you vegged out in front of a show while half thinking about your to-do list for that day. I mean truly rested, intentionally, without any guilt. And for a lot of people, that memory is hard to find. And for some of you, you're not even sure you've ever experienced it. Because somewhere along the way, you were taught quietly and consistently that rest was something you had to earn. That stillness was laziness. That if you weren't producing, you weren't worth much. So today we are going to trace exactly where that lie came from, who built it, who profits from it, and what it would mean, what it would actually feel like to take your rest back. Because rest is not a radical act. It is a requirement, and it was stolen from us on purpose. Welcome back to the Unpopular Teacher. I'm Annie Lee, and this is The Great Unlearning. The Great Unlearning is a practice of dismantling everything we were taught that was never actually true about who we are and what we deserve, quite frankly. Last week in episode 9, we talked about what it means to be stimulated versus nourished. We got into the biology of dopamine, why our brains are running an ancient software in a world that was engineered to exploit it, and what it actually means to come back to what fills us up. If you haven't listened to that one yet, I would start there, because everything that we talk about today builds on top of that foundation. So today we are going in on rest, episode 10. And I want to be very clear about what I mean when I say rest. Because this is not a wellness episode about sleep hygiene tips or the perfect bedtime routine or your circadian rhythm, right? What we are doing today is much bigger than that. We are talking about the systemic, historical, and deeply intentional ways that rest has been stripped from working people, from immigrant communities, from Black and brown communities, and how that theft became so normalized that we now police ourselves. We carry the whip on behalf of the system. We call ourselves lazy for needing sleep. We feel guilty for taking a vacation. But that guilt was engineered. It was manufactured. And today we're going to trace exactly how. So let's start with the body, because I always want to anchor us in what is actually physically, biologically true before we get into the systems and the history and the societal cultures and expectations. So when we receive adequate quality rest, and I mean real rest, we set the foundation to operate from our highest consciousness, right? And that is not a spiritual exaggeration. That is just science. Quality rest over time has been proven to restore the immune system, to reduce inflammation, replenish energy, declutter the mind, and support tissue repair throughout the body. It gives us the absolute baseline to think clearly, to feel clearly, to make decisions from a place of alignment rather than from depletion. We talked in episode 9 about the sympathetic nervous system, how chronic overstimulation keeps the body in fight or flight, and how you literally cannot heal, digest, create, or love from that state. Rest is what brings the body back to parasympathetic mode. Rest is equilibrium. Rest is where restoration happens. So ask yourself this: if rest is this powerful, if it is this essential to a human being's ability to think, to heal, to feel, to create, why has it been the single most consistently denied resource to the most overworked people throughout all of recorded history? Why is it that people doing the most grueling physical labor have always had the least access to recovery? That is not a coincidence. That is the design. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Rest is sacred, and sacred things and systems built on power get weaponized. So let's go back. Because I think the only way to fully understand what's happening to us right now is to understand where it all started. Let's look across histories, across cultures, across continents, and you will find a consistent pattern. The enslaved, the colonized, the immigrants, the working poor, they have always been overworked, overexhausted, underfed, and underrested. This is not incidental. Overworking the powerless is one of the oldest and most reliable tools of control ever invented. Because a person who is exhausted cannot organize. They cannot resist. They cannot imagine something different from what is. Productivity wasn't just incentivized for these communities. Stillness was made dangerous, literally dangerous. If you were enslaved and you were caught resting, truly resting, not performing labor, that had consequences. The anxiety that so many of us feel when we are doing nothing, that inability to sit still, that crawling guilt when we are not being productive, that is not a personal character flaw. For many of us, that is inherited. That is generations of nervous systems that were trained under threat, that rest is not safe. Now let's fast forward to the Industrial Revolution. Factory workers were being worked to the bone, right? 16, 18-hour days to maximize the output of manufacturing empires. It became such a public health crisis that Henry Ford, and I really want you to sit with the irony of this, right? Henry Ford, the man whose industry created this environment of overwork, then positioned himself as the solution. He capped the work week at 40 hours with 2 days off. And eventually that standard was codified into law through the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. So the person who broke the system then got to play the role of the hero for fixing it. And what do we get? A 2-day weekend. Just enough, 2 days to recover, right? Just enough to do it all again on Monday. Now, communal rest, right? The kind that was built into ancient cultures as a right, not a reward, was replaced with a recovery window. And we called it a life. And let's talk about school, because this is where it starts for all of us. Rockefeller funded the creation of the modern American school system that we know today. And his most infamous quote was, I want you to really hear this, right? Because this is important. I do not want a factory full of thinkers. I want a factory full of workers. And look at how schools are structured. The bells, the periods, the rigid schedules, the single file lines in the hallway, the cafeteria lines. It was all designed, explicitly designed, to prepare children for industrial life. It's the school to corporate pipeline, right, that's existed for decades. To condition them to follow structure, produce on command, and ask no questions. From kindergarten, output is how you are measured. Grades, attendance, behavior, sitting still and producing. We never learned how to just be, and then when we wonder why adulthood feels like one long performance review. And now the education system has become a massive business, right, in its own right, over testing children in exchange for more funding, burning them out before they've had a chance to be kids. We are preparing the next generation of workers for what awaits them. And the cycle continues. Now, I want to get personal here because I think the most powerful thing I can do on this show is let you see yourself in my story. Now, I obviously come from an immigrant family, and I started working at my parents' grocery store. It was called Apple Tree. It was in Hartford, Connecticut, back in the day, many, many, many decades ago. And I remember I started working there the summer that I had turned 11. Right, that was the first summer, and I did all kinds of things, right? I helped my dad set up the fruits and vegetables. I, eventually learned the prices of everything in the store that we sold, which, changed weekly. So you had to rememorize everything because we didn't have one of those fancy POS systems at the time. And we specialize in exotic produce, right? So fruits and vegetables that were eaten by pretty much anyone non-white, essentially. And that's also when I was first exposed to Spanish in a real living way, which gave me somewhere to practice what I was learning in school at the time. Now, my parents worked 7 days a week, 12-hour days, and we barely even closed on holidays. Like, I think we really took like just New Year's Day and Christmas off. And I grew up watching them work to the bone without complaining, without stopping. And I want to be very clear. I share this history not to victimize my family, but because I recognize that now what I absorbed from watching that, coming from an immigrant family, you are valued in this country by how much you produce. And that is an asinine concept when you say it out loud. Immigrants are some of the most hardest working people on this earth because they have to make it work here. There is no safety net. There is no fallback. There's only the faith that a better life exists on the other side of the long hours and grueling days. And yet they get paid the least. They are taken advantage of most frequently. They don't complain because complaining feels like taking up space they weren't sure they were even allowed to occupy in the first place. And I absorbed all of that, whether I knew it or not. I subconsciously learned that my value is tied to my work, to my production, to how much money I can generate. And I want to say clearly, this is not unique to immigrant families. Like, of course, immigrant families carry a very specific intersectional lens that adds the layers of nuance, right? But the broader American hustle culture has sold the same myth to everyone. That your worth is your productivity. That rest is laziness in disguise. And I had to do a lot of unlearning to understand that who I am is not what I produce. Now, I want to talk about how this plays out for the greater general population, because I think it's important to name the mechanism clearly. When I say the system, I want to be specific about what I mean. All right, I'm not talking about some conspiracy theory. I'm talking about the massive interlocking engine of society. Economic systems, political systems, financial systems, racial hierarchies, patriarchal structures, the educational system, the health system. All of these systems together comprise what I call the system, and they all feed each other. And here is how the rest theft works in modern life. They get you addicted to things: bags, cars, clothes, gadgets, phone, new tech, whatever your particular flavor is. And they get you so dependent on consuming these things that our society has reached a point where a huge portion of people genuinely cannot imagine life without having their stuff. So how do you afford all of this? You work more. Longer hours, double shifts, multiple jobs. You trade your time, the most finite resource that you have, for money to buy the things they convinced you that you need. And here's the part that I need you to really sit with. The desire for all of that stuff, that was manufactured too. We talked about this in episode 9. Advertising's entire purpose is to make you feel like you are lacking something so that their product can fill the emotional gap. So you are engineered to feel inadequate. And then you are handed a solution. Work more, buy more. That just deepens the cycle. And on top of that, they engineered the guilt. There have been countless studies showing that Americans feel guilty relaxing on their days off, checking emails obsessively, thinking about their workload the entire weekend, unable to be present in their own lives. And we praise the people who put in the most hours. We call them dedicated. We call them team players. We give them the overtime pay and tell them they earned it without ever asking what they gave up to get it. So I ask you, what is 1 hour of your life worth? Sit with that. Is it $25? $50? $200? What is the actual value of one irretrievable hour of your existence? Capitalism co-opted spiritual language to make all of this feel sacred. Overwork became a calling. Burnout became sacrifice. Ambition became a moral virtue. We were sold a theology of productivity, and rest got labeled as laziness. And we believe it. Now I need to say something that might make some of you uncomfortable. Rest and equity is not distributed equally. Studies have shown that Black Americans and low-income communities are chronically sleep-deprived at disproportionate rates, tied directly to housing instability, noise pollution in urban areas, working multiple jobs, food deserts, and the chronic stress that comes from navigating systemic racism every single day. The most disenfranchised communities in America are being targeted to be sleep-deprived, overfed with processed and nutrient-poor food, which is often the only food available in urban Black and brown neighborhoods, by the way, and then made to feel lesser for simply existing. All while the system profits most from the same people it is most actively harming. That is not an accident. That is the design. And when I say that, I hope it makes you angry, because it should. Now, here's what I keep coming back to. Our bodies are extraordinarily intelligent. They are always communicating with us, and they know when they are being lied to. When we continue to ignore the signals, the fatigue, the brain fog, the inflammation, the anxiety, the chronic health issues that seem to have no clear causes, we are not getting away with anything. We are making a withdrawal from an account that will eventually run dry. Remember what we learned in episode 8. The soul speaks first through emotion. If you ignore that, it speaks through mental distress. And if you ignore that, it manifests through the body. Chronic rest deprivation is not just tiredness. Over time, it becomes an actual illness. It becomes immune dysfunction. It becomes a body forcing you to stop because you refuse to stop willingly. Choosing rest is not weakness. It is not laziness. And it is not opting out. Choosing rest is choosing yourself over the machine. And it is one of the most radical acts of self-preservation available to you. And it is yours to take back. The system profits from keeping you in sympathetic mode, depleted, anxious, consuming, and producing. But you are not a cog. You are not a resource. You are a soul in a body that is asking very clearly to be given the conditions it needs to actually live. So what do we actually do with all of this? Because I don't want to leave you with just the diagnosis. I want to talk about the prescription. And the first thing I want to say is this. I am not asking you to quit your job, to renounce capitalism, and move into the woods. That is not the work, right? And that's crazy. You wouldn't survive. But the work is internal first. It always is. The work is beginning to examine the guilt. When you feel the crawling anxiety of doing nothing instead of immediately reaching for your phone or finding something productive to do, pause. Get curious and ask, where did this come from? Whose voice is that telling me I'm not allowed to stop? Because 9 times out of 10, it is not your voice. It is an inherited one. And inherited things can be returned. The work is beginning to redefine what productivity means to you, not to your employer, not to your family, not to your culture, to you. What would it mean to have a day that felt full and meaningful, that included genuine rest? What would it mean to protect your sleep the way you protect your deadlines? Nearly every ancient culture built mandatory rest into the social structure, not as a reward, but as a right. Meditation, prayer, fasting, time in nature, Sabbath. These were not optional lifestyle upgrades. These were technologies for keeping human beings connected to themselves and to each other. And we traded all of that for the 40-hour week in a 2-day recovery window. So you can start small. 1 hour of genuine, intentional, guilt-free rest. Not earned, not scheduled as a reward for finishing everything on your list, because that list will never be finished. Because you are a human being, and that is enough of a reason. I believe that when we receive adequate sleep and rest, we set the foundation to operate from our highest consciousness. Not our most productive consciousness, our highest. And that distinction matters more than I can say. We were meant to live this life joyously, lovingly, peacefully on this earth. And that is not naivety. That is not toxic positivity. That is our birthright. We were created in the image of something far greater than the system, whatever name you want to give that greatness. God, Allah, universe. And somewhere in the noise and the grind and the guilt and the hustle, we forgot that. The great unlearning is a practice of remembering, of peeling back everything that was placed on top of who we truly are and returning to what was always there underneath. So here is today's anchor. Rest is not a reward. It is a requirement. Take that with you this week, and the next time you feel that guilt creeping in when you're trying to rest or take a day off, stop. Recognize it. Name it for what it is. An engineered response designed to keep you producing for a system that was never actually built for you. And then rest anyway. Thank you for being here. If this episode resonated, please share it with someone who needs to, hear it. Leave a review. Please if you're moved to. It generally helps the show reach more people doing this work. So thank you all again. I'll see you next week. Please take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember that you are not what you produce. You already just are.